Welcome you here to this wonderful evening of studying some Kabbalah and modern art. But before I introduce my guest over here, Rabbi Eli Rubin, I just would like to share that this class and this evening is sponsored by Chabad of Coal Valley in memory of a dear friend, Robert Clark. Robert Clark was a professor at Stanford, and he passed away just a couple of years ago. And he and I would study Kabbalah and Hasidism together, specifically a section of the Tanya called Shar HaYichud VaEmunah. And he wouldn't just read it, he would study it word for word, and he would help me understand new insights into Kabbalah and Hasidism that I had been studying all my life. And so after his passing, I took on a personal, intentional hachlata, a resolution that I'm going to try and incorporate some Kabbalistic teachings and lectures at Chabad of Coal Valley at least once a year. And so we're very delighted to have my childhood friend, Rabbi Eli Rubin, to share with us on this topic of overcoming the void in modern Kabbalah and modern art. Rabbi Eli Rubin is an editor at Chabad.org and is a writer on Chabad.org. If you look up his name, you have some very fascinating, deep teachings of Hasidism and Kabbalah written for a wide audience. And I've studied many of his works, particularly on this topic of Tzimtzum, as you're going to hear. And also, Rabbi Eli is in town for a conference of the Jewish Studies, Association of Jewish Studies, who are having a conference right now here in San Francisco. And that is why Rabbi Eli is here presenting over there as well. So without further ado, Rabbi Eli Rubin, please jump right in. And I think we should probably switch off the music. Give me 1 second if we can do that effectively. Okay, that's not it, but we'll close that.
I'll just, yeah.
All right. To get to the next tab. And that's 11.
Oh, never mind. No, you just pause it.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay. It's good to have great helpers.
Okay. Thanks so much for hosting me. It's really nice when you go away and get to meet up with an old friend and new friends. And often when you go to an academic conference, you just stay in the hotel for like 3 days and you never leave, right? So this is like, wow, there's a world outside and I can get back in touch with reality and real people who aren't academics. Now, this presentation has a special connection to San Francisco, and it actually deals with a little Kabbalistic mystery, or maybe a large Kabbalistic mystery that has its home in San Francisco. And that is that at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, there is a sculpture. I'm going to just fast forward quickly through the slides to show you a photo. There we go. There's a sculpture, Tzimtzum 1 at SOFMA. Unfortunately, it's now no longer on display. It was on display till August, but it is part of their permanent collection. So maybe at some point it will be put back, be reinstalled. And as one of the academics, one of the professors who I just gave a presentation on this 2 hours ago at the conference. He commented that it's very appropriate that a sculpture on Tzimtzum should be withdrawn, because one of the ways of interpreting Tzimtzum is as divine withdrawal. So he actually went to he told me, well, I wanted to go and see it. I knew it wasn't there, but I wanted to see at least the place where it used to be. So, okay. So, really, this sculpture is a mystery because art historians have recognized its creator, whose name was Barnett Newman, as someone who obviously was influenced by Kabbalah. And they tried to explain how and what he was doing and how Kabbalah related to his art. And they were not able to crack the code, partly because they weren't Kabbalists, they were art historians. And sometimes to crack a art mystery, you need to be a Kabbalist. And what I tried to do was crack the mystery from a Kabbalistic perspective. And there's two approaches that I took. One is that I read his archive. I went to, his archive is in Manhattan, and I asked the archivist there for any material that they could find that related to this sculptor. And I read it, and that gave me some clues. So the way I'm going to start this is with three quotations. One from this figure, who you might be familiar with, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, the founder of Chabad. Another from the artist Barnett Newman. This is from a published essay that he wrote. And a third from the seventh Rebbe of Chabad, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Nachman Mendel Schneerson. And with these three quotations, this will just give us a kind of conceptual orientation to see a starting point, a conceptual starting point for a shared concern, a shared question that the Hasidic masters had, and which Barnett Newman was also putting at the forefront of his artistic project. And with that starting point, that will open the way for getting deeper into the weeds, as it were, the Kabbalistic weeds, or maybe the Kabbalistic garden. Hopefully, we'll be able to understand both the concept of Tzimtzum as it is understood within Chabad better, and we'll also be able to understand what Newman was doing in his artwork, and what kind of a role, why was Tzimtzum so important for him that he created the sculpture representing it. Okay, so the first quote, we need to explain, to understand somewhat, the notion of the Shekhinah's indwelling in the innermost temple chamber, the Holy of Holies, and likewise every other instance of the Shekhinah's indwelling. What is its significance? After all, the entire earth is filled with his glory, and there is no place empty of him. So this is a question that the Alter Rebbe asks in the beginning of the conclusion of the Tanya. Right? So if you just look at the first part of Tanya, has 53 chapters, and the last three chapters begin with this question, and the last three chapters are dedicated to answering this question. And the question is built on a premise. The premise is that the world is suffused with God. There's divinity in everything. God is everywhere. If so, everywhere is holy. If so, why do we consecrate a specific place, the temple, and within the temple, a holy of holies? What does it mean to have a holy? How can one place be holier than any other place if God is everywhere? That is the question. We're going to leave the answer aside. Okay. What's important here is the question. Barnett Newman. Move this over. And he's saying this in response to the question, what is his art about? When the Passover falls on the Sabbath, the Jew is caught in a dilemma between the holiness of the festival and the holiness of the Sabbath. And his blessing then becomes, blessed be thou, O Lord, who distinguishes between what is holy and what is holy. So he's pointing to a similar, we have the Holy of Holies, and we have the question of how to distinguish between what is holy and what is holy. That's the problem, the artistic problem, and I think the true spiritual dimension. So we see his question is the same question that the Alter Rebbe was asking. If he's inhabiting a perspective from which everything is holy. And his question is, how do you distinguish between the holy and the holy? And what he's doing over here is, this actually demonstrates his knowledge of Judaism, right? He grew up, let's fill in some biographical details over here. Barnett Newman was born in New York City in 1905 to parents, Jewish parents, who had immigrated from Poland, from Łódź, if I remember correctly. And here he's talking about a specific event that happens some years at the Passover Seder. It doesn't happen every year. If Passover falls out on Sabbath, we incorporate a special blessing into the Kiddush, which is also the Havdalah, right? So at the beginning of Yom Tov or Shabbos, we make Kiddush, and at the end we make Havdalah to separate between the holy and the mundane, the Shabbat and the weekday. But on the festival, we don't distinguish between the holy and the mundane because we're beginning a holy festival. So instead we make a blessing, we do have Havdalah, separation, but we distinguish between the holy and the holy. And he points to this and says, this is what my art is about. This problem of how to distinguish between one kind of holiness and another kind of holiness. Okay. Third quotation from the Rebbe, who is seventh in line after 7 generations. He is the 7th Rebbe of Chabad. He said as follows: in the Messianic future, worship will be in a manner of ascent within the realm of holiness itself, to the point that in that era there won't be any notion of differentiation between the holy and the mundane. Instead, the differentiation will be between what is holy and what is holy. Right? So we see that here we have a new element. What the Rebbe is introducing here is that this problem of distinguishing between the holy and the holy is actually a kind of messianic problem, right? What kind of problems will we have when Mashiach comes, when the world is perfect, when we see that everything is suffused with God? The problem then will be the spiritual work. They'll still be spiritual, but the work will be to distinguish between what is holy and what is holy. Okay. Now I'm going to skip this. If I can, if it will let me. How to get to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so here's just a brief overview of Newman's biography and his relationship with Kabbalah. Just say a couple of points. I'm not going to read the whole thing over there, but Newman originally started out life as a teacher and an art critic. Apparently, he produced art before the mid-1940s, but destroyed it all. And the paintings that survive are all from the mid-1940s and onward. That means from after the Second World War and let's say after the Holocaust. And he actually said at one point, the problem was after the Holocaust, how could we make art? What could we depict? And that might have something to do with why he destroyed his previous work and started something else. He started experimenting. We're gonna get into some of his experimentation and then what he finally found, a new way of doing art, which he felt expressed what he wanted to express, what he called a fullness, a full declaration. One other point which we should mention is that he often referenced biblical phrases or Kabbalistic phrases in titling his works. So our critics knew that he's engaging with Jewish sources and he's engaging with Kabbalah, but they didn't know what to make of it, right? And essentially the general consensus was, yes, he read some Kabbalistic books, but he didn't really have a serious engagement with Kabbalah. It was just kind of a symbol, Tzimtzum was a nice symbol. He found these phrases evocative or something like that. And so he attached them to his art, but his art is really secular, it's universal, and he He took these symbols and he just used them in a general way. But the truth is that Newman was actually not only did he have a pretty good Jewish education, but he actually said things like, religion is a concern with art. He spoke of the artist as imitating God, just as God, the creator, wrested truth from the void in creating the world. There was the void, there was nothingness, and God, out of that nothingness, created. The artist, too, is attempting to wrest truth from the void, right? So he actually compared the work of an artist to a kind of religious imitation of God, which is actually a commandment in the Torah, lihidamu loy, to emulate God, right? Just as God is kind, we should be kind. Just as we should be merciful, just as God is merciful, we should be merciful, right? This is a positive command. One of the 613 mitzvot is to imitate God, imitate God's qualities. And Newman took this as just as God is the creator, so too we should be creators, right? And that's really a very old Jewish idea that humanity is a partner in the creation, right? That the world is unfinished in some way. We say in Kiddush, he referenced the Havdalah, but in Kiddush we say God created the world God created the world to make, not God created the world and made it, but he created the world lasis, to do, to act. And the Medrash says, lasis means the sakin, to perfect it. In other words, God created the world to a point, and he left it in humanity's hands to bring it to the full completion, which is what we associate with the Messianic era. Okay? So now, going a step further, this sculpture that's at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art was based on an architectural design that Newman made for a synagogue, okay, which was never built. And here you see the windows. The main architectural feature of this synagogue is on either side of the sanctuary. Here you have the ark. On either side of the sanctuary, you have these zigzagging glass panels, which are windows through which light could enter from both sides and envelop the whole space of the sanctuary in this powerful light. And on the bottom, you see he's written in Hebrew script, pretty nice handwriting. B'shulav Malay Masayachol, spelling mistake, an I instead of an Aleph. Apart from that, it looks like he just wrote it like off the cuff. It doesn't look like it seems like he was a fairly practiced writer of Hebrew script, right? This is a phrase from Isaiah, in the prophecy of Yeshaya, in which he sees an image of God, and the robes of God the ends of the robes of God fill the temple. Right? So this is an image of God's presence in the holy place, right? And so we have this idea that Tzimtzum is a way for God to be revealed in the sanctuary. Right? This is the opposite of the way Tzimtzum is often understood, which is, like I said before, Tzimtzum as withdrawal. Right? He understands Tzimtzum as creating a light-filled place, right? Which is, as we'll see, this is the Hasidic interpretation of Tzimtzum, right? So this is one of the mistakes that the scholars made, that most art historians made when they looked at Newman and they saw the word Tzimtzum. Well, they read some scholarly work on Kabbalah, and they read that Tzimtzum means withdrawal. So obviously they couldn't make any sense of what Newman was doing, because his concept of Tzimtzum was not the old Kabbalistic concept of Tzimtzum. It was the Hasidic concept of Tzimtzum. Okay, how do I know this? How do I know that his concept of Tzimtzum is the Hasidic concept of Tzimtzum? Okay. So let's actually go forward first, and we'll come back. I'm going to turn to this text by Martin Buber. Okay? Martin Buber is probably one of the most famous popularizers of Hasidic stories and of Hasidic ideas. we don't, as Chabadics, we don't always agree with everything he says. Sometimes he gets it right, sometimes he gets it wrong. He had his own theories that he liked to project onto Hasidic stories, especially. But in this instance, I think we have a good representation of the Hasidic idea of Tzimtzum. And the reason why I'm using this is because I checked out what was in Barnett Newman's library. Okay, and he had two books by Shalom, great academic scholar of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, who wrote about the classical old idea of Tzimtzum before Hasidism. He also wrote about Hasidism, but only as like a footnote. Later, as a last chapter, he called Hasidism the final phase, the last phase of Kabbalah, and it was almost like he even thought Hasidism wasn't going to continue much longer. It's outlived him by 50 years or so. Anyway, but in Newman's library, first of all, the books by Shalom that he had are dated. They were published after Newman was already working on something. So I don't think that was his primary source. He has 6 books by Buber in his library, including a book called Hasidism, which has this quote. And this book by Hasidism was published in the year 1948, which is the year that Newman created the first painting, which he said, this is really what I was trying to do. He experimented before that for about 3 or 4 years, from 1946, 1947. In 1948, he finally felt he'd arrived. And in that year, we have this edition of Buber's book on Hasidism, where he talks about Tzimtzum. His spelling of Tzimtzum is the same as Newman's spelling, with a Z, right? Zim Zum. Unlike Shalom, who writes TS, right? So there are a bunch of different signs, right? Both looking at the text, looking at his library, looking at the concept he has of Tzimtzum. His concept is Hasidic through Buber. And really, this idea from Buber is not Buber's idea. It's the Alter Rebbe's idea. It's chapters 46 to 49 of Tanya. There is a beautiful explanation of Tzimtzum. You mentioned before Shayach B'Amunah. Chapter 7 of Shayach B'Amunah has an amazing conceptual, theoretical explanation of Tzimtzum and a proof for the non-literal reading that Tzimtzum means suffusion of the world with God's presence and not the removal of God. That's in chapter 7. But in chapter 46, chapter 7 of Shayach, but in chapter 46 to 49, the Alter Rebbe talks about Tzimtzum as creating relationship. That God limited himself and entered into this limited world in order to have a relationship with humanity. And that we should therefore reciprocate by withholding ourselves from the things that God doesn't want and embracing God in reciprocal love instead, right? So Tzimtzum allows for this embrace, for this relationship, for us to turn to God. As he phrases it, he uses the biblical phrase, as water mirrors the face of a person, right? That when you look in the mirror, you see yourself reflected. And if you smile, your reflection smiles back. So too, as God expressed himself through Tzimtzum, creating a space for loving embrace, we should reciprocate and respond to God with loving embrace. Okay? So that's the idea as it is in Tanya. And here it is in more contracted form in this paragraph that Buber wrote. The book is called Hasidism. It's pages, I think, 48 and 49. It's covering it up, but you can find it. What? I can remove it. Or should I press? This. Okay. Okay, so God wanted an independent. Let's see if I can remember this. Pick this and move it. Okay. God wanted an independent otherness. which would be free in its knowing, free in its loving, free in its willing. He set it free. Okay, this is the meaning of Tzimtzum, contraction. But this otherness, on the one hand, there's a creating of space and opening up of space. So there is a kind of withdrawal, which allows for, let's say, subjective freedom, right? The sense that we are individuals, that we can make choices, we can choose to love, we can choose, our will is something that we are in control of. Our knowledge, right? We have a subjective knowledge. But this otherness, this power, exempted from eternal being and left to its freedom, was limited in its freedom only by its own doing. It surged forth beyond its garden-air purity. Becoming burst forth out of being. So it's very poetic, but what he's saying is that on the basic level of existence, everything that became, everything that's created, everything that emerges in the world, it comes out of being, meaning it comes out of the fundamental being of God. So while we are free in our actions and what we can know, what we can desire, in our essential being and our existence, we are not free of God because everything is God. The basis of everything is God. So God, on the one hand, suffuses everything and is the basis of all existence. On the other hand, he's kind of, as it were, withdrawn on an experiential level in order for allow us to know him, to love him, to desire him as individuals. Right? So this Tzimtzum creates the space for individuality, for subjectivity, without actually withdrawing God from the world. On the contrary, this allows for a relationship with God in the world. Right? Okay. Then he says, let's just read this line. In the outermost borderland, central things breaks the wave of God. Right? So this table, on this table, breaks the wave of God. Right? The outermost borderland of central things, physical thing, wine, whatever it's going to be, that's where the wave of God breaks. God is not removed from the world, but there is this space in which there can be a dynamic. There can be this image of the wave breaking. I think is a very kind of rich, dynamic idea of is present. There's the presence of God flowing here, but it's not flat. It's not just a static thing. Right? There's this drama. There's a drama of the relationship, of the loving relationship between man and God. God is hiding. God is revealing. The wave rushes and retreats, right? The waves go in and out. Okay, so this is a very beautiful way, I think. I think Buber did a good job of it. We can give him credit where credit's due, of expressing, again, an idea which he doesn't say it directly about this, but he says the great systematizer of Hasidic thought is Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, founder of Chabad. He writes this like a few pages before or after, I don't remember. Right? So it's clear to me that his idea, this fundamental idea that he has here, the Hasidic this is in his book Hasidism. It's the Hasidic interpretation of Tzimtzum, and probably it's based on chapters 46 to 49 of Tanya. And this I propose, I contend, is what Newman read and where Newman got his idea of Tzimtzum from. Now let's go back to Newman's notes. Okay. I'm going to put this up there. We're not going to read this whole thing, but this is from one page of the notes that he wrote in connection with his synagogue design. And here, I'm going to just focus on these last two lines. Aesthetic object, subjectivity, Tzimtzum. Okay, now, so this is, let's say, a high art theory. And my argument here is that his whole concept of art depends on the Hasidic understanding of Tzimtzum. And what he's saying over here is, aesthetic object means you have a beautiful object, right? Which is, let's say, the traditional way of thinking about art. You go to a museum and you see a beautiful thing that an artist has made. Very nice. Newman, not just here, but in a lot of his writings, says, I am not interested in creating an aesthetic object. That is not my purpose in creating art. My purpose in creating art is that the viewer, the person who stands in front of my artwork, actually becomes part of the art, and it's that person's subjective experience that creates the art. The art is not in the picture on the wall, it's not in the painting, it's in the experience of the person who stands in front of the artwork and feels exalted. Right? Here he has on the side, he has the word exalted underlined in a heavier hand. It's one of his key words. And what he's saying here is, art depends on subjectivity. Art depends on the individual who sees the art, who experiences it. If there's no individual seeing the art, it's not art. It can be as beautiful as you like. It's not art until somebody stands in front of it and has an exalted experience. And he's saying that depends on Tzimtzum. Without Tzimtzum, there's no subjectivity. So art depends on Tzimtzum. You can't have art without Tzimtzum because Tzimtzum is what allows for subjectivity. Tzimtzum is what allows there to be things that feel themselves to be other than God and in a relationship with God, or other than the artist, other than the creator. Creator with a capital C, creator with a small c, creator as artist. There can only be a relationship between the artist or the art and the viewer if there's a gap between them, if there's a place between them in which they can meet. And that is Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the creation of this special place that is at once suffused with the divine, with the light, with the exaltation of God, and also allows for the presence of a subjective individual who's other than God or other than the artist, who experiences that art, right? So this is, I could say a lot more about what he wrote in his notes and in his artist statement about the synagogue design and how, for example, I'll just say one example. He says, this synagogue that I designed, it's not that the building is a beautiful building. The art happens when the Torah is read in the synagogue. That's when the art happens, right? So, and it's when the individual reads the Torah, goes up on the bimah, and has this feeling of being under the light of Tzimtzum. This is his terms, right? And feels exalted in the presence of the light that flows, the divine light that radiates. That is when the art happens. The art doesn't happen when you have beautiful windows, whatever, nice design. No, that's not the art. The art is when the Torah is read. When I spoke just a few hours ago at the conference, one of the scholars there, a literary professor, he said, we were talking about this, a few of us gave talks who were related. We organized a session about art and Kabbalah. That was the theme. He said, what's happening here is that we're doing the opposite of what all academics like to do. All academics want to study a topic. I have my own private life, and I study this very fascinating topic. And he said, what all of these papers are doing is, and he was saying specifically about this, is that it's saying you can't actually have knowledge of something without doing it, without being within it, without subjectively entering into becoming part of the art. You can't know what art is if you're not part of the art. You can't know what religion is unless you do religion, right? You want to know what God is, you have to enter into a relationship with God. You can't just stand back and analyze God. You're not going to know anything about it. You have to enter into it as and encounter it as a practitioner, as an experiencer, as a subjective experiencer. And this is what Newman is saying here, right? The art doesn't happen until the Torah is read. Okay. So, let's see. I just paused for a second because I want to distinguish between everything that I've said till now and what I'm going to say in the next part of the presentation. What I've said till now is my analysis of what I think Newman was actually doing and thinking. And part of my argument is that all his art is really about this. He was trying to express this in all his paintings. The next piece is more, let's say, speculative. It's more, in fact, the argument I'm gonna make is about reading Newman's paintings in light of texts, in light of Chabad teachings that I'm sure he didn't know about. Because These were still in manuscript or only, very narrow circulation. They definitely weren't in translation. And he might have been able to read primary, he might have been able to read Hebrew, he was able to write Hebrew, but there's very little likelihood that he saw these texts. But somehow he came to a similar understanding of the nature of God, the nature of the purpose of existence, the nature of the Messianic, Mashiach. What is it? What is this ideal that that humanity is striving towards? He somehow came to a concept that very much mirrors some very key and radical Chabad teachings. Okay, but again, what I said till now, I think is, direct influence. He was reading this, he understood it, he thought about it, but then I think he went further, and the places he went to somehow ended up with the truth. Okay, so, miraculously. Okay, so we'll start out with this is the Tzimtzum is a very old idea. Tzimtzum goes back to Medrash, it goes all the way back. As long as there were Jewish people thinking, the ancient rabbis, they were already talking about Tzimtzum in certain ways. But in the modern period, meaning the last 500 years, the key, when we talk about Tzimtzum, usually we mean the Tzimtzum as taught by the Arizal. The Arizal was a great Kabbalist who lived in Safad, he passed away in 1572. And actually, we don't have a single line that he wrote about Tzimtzum, but it's his most famous teaching. Everything that we have is from his students. We have other stuff that he wrote, but about Tzimtzum we only have from his students. So the famous text here is this from Eitz Chaim by Chaim Vital, one of Arizal's students. And I'm not going to read the text. I'll just say quickly outside. In the basic notion of Tzimtzum, there are two phases, the way it's described in the Arizal's teachings. There are two phases. You could say three, but I'll just say two, okay? So I'm going to concentrate on these two images, which this image on the bottom is actually taken from a 19th century edition of Eitz Chaim. And it's a diagram, okay? And the diagram, we're going to talk about two phases, okay? So the first phase is a void. God withdrew from the place of the cosmos and left a void empty of divine revelation. Then, in the second stage, God expressed a flow of divine illumination in the form of a line. So, obviously, this is not about space and time. It's much more abstract, but just for the sake of having to speak some kind of language, we use this almost geometric imagery of the cosmos as a space, as a place from which God has withdrawn his revelation. And then, in order to create the world, God flows back into this void in a limited way. That's the general idea. So those are the two phases. Then we have a third phase. Now, let me just go back. I don't have all of examples in this slideshow, but Newman, in his early painting, also had two phases. The first phase, which this is an example of that, was concerned with the abyss, with the void. And he has a bunch of different paintings like this. Some of them, most of them actually have a spherical void. I should have put an example of that here, but most of them actually have a spherical void, which looks very similar to the depiction in the Kabbalistic diagrams. If they don't, then it has the word void or abyss in the title. Then he did another series of paintings, which he didn't exhibit for about 10 years. He kept them on the racks. But produced in the same period, 1946, 1947. And here he begins to have these streaks, similar to this, but not quite like this. He has like a void or a kind of atmospheric darkness, and then light, beams of light shooting into it. But these beams of light are not straight from top to bottom. They're kind of slanted. They start off wider and slant downwards. So which is kind of mirrors the Kabbalistic idea of how initially when God flows into the world, when he flows back into the void, it's with abundance, and then as it gets lower and lower, there's the order of the world. The higher world is more light, more revelation of God, and the lower world is less revelation of God. In the lowest realms, God is almost completely hidden, right? And that's how you can get idol worship, because people completely forget about God. That's how you can get atheism. People, there's no revelation of God. That's a product of this narrowing of the light. And in this series of paintings, these streaks of light don't always reach the bottom of the painting. Then, in 1948, he creates this third kind of image. And here you have a dark background, but it's not black. It's not the abyss. It itself has some kind of a quality, an expressiveness. And the line that goes through it goes from top to bottom. And after he did this painting, he said, now I felt like I actually did the paintings that I was trying to do. And all his paintings afterwards had the same model. There were different colors. Some of them had multiple bands, wider and smaller, wider and narrower, but they're all straight bands from top to bottom. Sometimes the band is imposed on top of the background. Sometimes it kind of disrupts. You would like put a tape. You put tape and paint, and then rip the tape off, and then that completed the painting. Right here in this first one, he also put tape, and he painted over it initially to test the color, and he was intending to take it off. But then he said, when I put the paint on to test it, and I stood back and looked at it, I realized that the painting was complete. Right? So now, because they're so simple, this is part of the mystery of his art. And not only is it a mystery, people have actually been angry. Like there was an art museum in Canada which paid millions of dollars for one of these massive paintings, which is like 3 bands of color. That's it, right? And there was like a massive uproar about it, and I think someone actually went and slit the painting with a knife, right? And there's a book about this, Rage. I can't remember what it's called, Fire and Rage or something. About the anger that Newman's art inspired, because it's like, what's going on here, right? So to maybe one way to answer this question is to go back to the notion of Tzimtzum, right? We have these 2 phases. We have the phase of the void, which is like Newman's first initial series of paintings are concerned with the void, the abyss, and they have this spherical void. Then he starts doing lines, but they're tapered lines. They're lines that don't go all the way to the bottom, and he's not satisfied. He doesn't exhibit these paintings for like 10 years after he's already exhibited the 1948 painting that I showed you before, and he's already done a bunch of other paintings. Then he pulls some of these out of his archive, right, and exhibits them. But he's unsatisfied with that because the void is still there. He hasn't yet accomplished. He hasn't reached, let's say, he hasn't reached the messianic. He hasn't expressed what he calls a declaration of fullness. He says these paintings are hollow. They don't say they don't fully express what I'm trying to say. The third phase is not in the classical Lurianic texts. The classical Lurianic texts, they finish with this, that there's this God flows back into the void in a limited way, and that's it, right? But then in Chabad, we have a third phase, okay? And this is a quote from the Alter Rebbe. in the Messianic future, the primordial light that encompasses the cosmos, transcending the entire void with a singular equanimity, will reveal itself within the Kav. So he's saying here that the infinitude of God that preceded the void will be fully revealed in that narrow flow of God into the world that will be fully suffused with the infinitude of God in its fullness, not in a limited way. That's what's going to happen in the Messianic era. And it will extend to the lowest extremity of the void. It will go all the way to the bottom, bridging the gap of transcendence from one extreme to the other. The concealed transcendence itself, which is infinite, shall completely reveal itself within the circumscriptions of the cosmos. So here we have the Kav going, not petering out as it gets lower into the world. It's going to go all the way through the world, and the infinitude will go all the way through the world till the bottom. And let's go to the next quote. This is from Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe. It's in the last discourse of a famous series of discourses known as Ranat. Okay. There he says, let's just move this to the bottom. The lowest extremity of the Kav will also be attached to the encompassing infinitude like its highest extremity. So just like the highest peak of the cosmos flows out of the infinite, so too that light will suffuse the world, and the lowest point of the cosmos will also be connected to the infinite in exactly the same way. Okay? Someone told me this is an unprecedented thing. You don't find this in any Kabbalistic text until he said Rashab, but I found it in the Alter Rebbe. Usually most things in Chabad, eventually, if you look hard enough, you'll find it in the Alter Rebbe, at least in a limited way. Okay? Therefore, let's just go back a minute. Okay. Although it will still be a Kav, and there will therefore be individuated stations, yet in all of them, the infinite and transcendent essence itself will shine. Therefore, even the individuated stations delineated by the Kav will not be divided from one another. So here we have this idea that on the one hand, the world will be completely suffused with the infinitude of God in a way that every place in the world, highest and lowest, will be equal. And yet, they'll be distinct. Right? There's still a line, there's still a hierarchy. Every point on the hierarchy is equally infinite, God is equally present in every place. And yet, each thing has its own distinct identity. We won't be erased. The existence of the world as we live them now, with tables and chairs and people and animals, and each person having their perspective and their experience and their knowledge, what they bring to the table, that will remain intact. The individuality will remain intact, and yet it will all be equally suffused with God. Right? So this is a very paradoxical idea, but this is the Messianic idea. Right? The Messianic idea is not one of returning the world back to before the world was created, so that there will be only God. Rather, the world will exist and yet be suffused with God as it was prior to there being anything, right? Okay, now, so we have this idea here of the beginning and end being equal, of there being a Kav which splits, which divides one thing from another, and yet everything is one. And this is exactly what Newman says about this new painting that he discovered by accident, because he stepped back and the painting was finished. He says, he calls this line my zip. That's the word that he used. He invented this word. After so many hours talking at the conference, and now here. My throat starts to get out. Okay, so he says, my zip does not divide my painting. I feel it does the exact opposite. It unites the thing. It's a totality. The beginning and the end are there at once. So exactly the same idea as the Rashab says. The beginning and the end are there at once. There's no distinction, Rabbi Rashab said, there's no distinction between up and down, right? It's a totality. Everything is one. The infinitude suffuses everything. It's full with God, right? Full with what he's, as he said, declaring. And the way that fullness happens is through a divide, through this line. The divide is not a divisive divide. It's a line that brings everything together. It's a line of infinity, which encompasses everything, brings everything together. Yeah.
What is referred to in individualized stations?
So, yeah, so that, well, broadly speaking, what he means is that in the Kabbalah, you have a notion of different worlds, higher worlds and lower worlds. And he's saying that these realms will still exist as individuated realms. They won't all become the same. Right? So let's say there's the realm of the angels. And that realm will still be the realm of the angels, and this physical world will still be this physical world. It won't be like the physical will evaporate and become, ethereal. We won't all just suddenly arise to be like angels. No, we'll remain embodied physical, and the angels will remain angels. And yet we'll share in the suffusion of everything with the infinite.
Mm-hmm.
And the same way that the angels experience the infinite, will experience the infinite, but not as angels, as people, right? So those are the stations. You can break that down even more, right? There's, within the physical realm, there's also stations, right? There's human, there's animals, there's inanimate, right? The cosmos is built of hierarchies. And this is a kind of paradoxical idea, because on the one hand, he's undermining the hierarchy and saying that every point of the hierarchy is equal in its relation to God. And yet, the hierarchy remains intact in a certain way. It just, maybe now we need to turn on its side, right? And say that one is not above the other, or it's only up to, one above the other in a certain sense. Or maybe we could say, flip it around, right? Because the end is connected directly to the infinite, just like the highest is connected directly to the infinite, right? So this is, again, to use a Kabbalistic kind of phrase, not to chalasim b'seifan. The beginning is embedded in the end, and the end in the beginning, right? So which implies that there's still a beginning and an end, and yet they are, in Barnett Newman's terms, the beginning and the end are there at once, not as separate things. Okay. Let's conclude by going all the way back to the beginning, and reading again this quote, because in a way this really wraps up. Now we can understand what the Rebbe was saying here, I think. In the Messianic future, the worship will be in a manner of ascent within the realm of holiness itself, to the point that in that era, there won't be any notion of differentiation between the holy and the mundane. Instead, the differentiation will be between what is holy and what is holy. Chaim.
Now we'll take some questions. If anyone has any comments or questions, we can field them now. Is there anyone here in person want to?
The main thing is that everyone should lobby the San Francisco Museum of Barnett to put the Newman sculpture back on display, so that everyone can go and experience the exaltation. Or you could just, light Shabbos candles.
Is anyone on the Zoom that would like to ask a question? You can unmute yourself.
Thing on the chat. Okay, so we'll repeat any question. We'll have to repeat them.
Wow. If I can ask a question, and that is, do you find different ideas in the art world as being somewhat prevalent, or this is an exception? I don't know if you had it.
Right. So, okay, so the question was, do we find in general in the art world that there is an interest in Kabbalah or usage of Kabbalah? So, I mean, the truth is that I'm not an art historian. I'm a historian of Chabad and of Chabad thought. So I don't know that much about art. This example caught my attention, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, and I kind of developed this obsession and kept on revisiting it until I had this discussion with someone who is more a literary scholar, but he also dabbles in art history. And he said, yeah, you've got to do something. But just from the discussions that I've been having today with a few other few professors who study art and, let's say, just literature in general, there is this fascinating thing that a lot of, especially in the 20th century, a lot of artists and a lot of writers, novelists, had this kind of interest in Kabbalah, and not just in Kabbalah, but also just, let's say, Jewish mystical folklore. There's like ideas like the Dybbuk, right? Which was a famous Russian writer who came from a Chabad background, also called Ansky, right? Basically, my theory is that all the great, almost all the great producers of modern Jewish culture, either came from Chabad background, like Chagall, right? He's a Chabad boy. Ansky was a Chabad boy. They basically all came from Chabad. And a lot of them, maybe not so much Chagall, but Ansky suddenly drawing on stories that he had, Hasidic stories that he heard, mystical stories that he heard, Kabbalistic ideas, Gilgul, right? These were ideas that were found in Kabbalistic books, and which he transformed into the modern genre of novels or theater, etc. So there is this theme there, and a woman, a professor at Swarthmore College, who's from a Latin American background, she gave an amazing, fascinating paper about how all these Latin American authors who are writing what's called magical realism, they're also drawing. They read scholarship on Kabbalah. They were interested in it, and they incorporated the same themes like Ansky did in their stories. And some of them are explicitly Jewish, and some of them are disguising in different ways. So apparently, in the 20th century, there was this, and maybe it has something to do with secularization and the need to retrieve something that was lost. We felt that they needed to go back to these sources to animate their secular creations. They understood that to create an art that is, to use a Barnett Newman term, sublime, that is beyond the ordinary, they needed to go beyond the ordinary. They had to find, and so they went back to Kabbalah, they went back to magical stories, and things like this, so that their art would, that their writing, that the literature, the novels would capture something that is really fundamentally human, that transcends, secular, mundane conceptions of humanity as just, another animal. They had to find language, that kind of language. They had to go back to these texts, even if they tried to maintain a secular exterior. Yeah.
Okay. So it says,
Read the messages.
It seems like you want to
Formulating thought.
okay. Go down to see the messages.
You mentioned those sculptures that you mentioned there in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Currently,
What's that?
the sculptures you mentioned
Yeah.
were subject of this presentation. They are actually housed today in the
Yeah.
San Francisco Museum
Yeah,
of Modern Art.
Yeah, so the question is, are these sculptures in the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art? Yes. The sculptures, Zim Zum and two of Newman's paintings, are held by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, but they're not on display.
They are not on display.
Not on display.
Why?
They told me they had to make room for other work. But my friend went today to the museum. He said, there's lots of space. I don't know. Yeah.
Do you know if whoever is in charge of sculpture departments,
Right.
the curators, are they aware of any of that, those Kabbalistic
Yes, so the question is, are the curators aware of the Kabbalistic reference? Yes, they are. And if you go to the website, San Francisco Museum of Barnett, there's actually a 2-minute audio clip about the relationship between Jewish mysticism and this sculpture. But you can listen to it. They don't know, they know there's some relationship, they don't know what it is, right? And a lot of scholars before me wrote about this and tried to figure something out, and I think all of them just didn't get it. They weren't equipped. They didn't have the knowledge to decipher. They were looking in the wrong places. They looked at Shalom. They didn't look at Buba. So they missed the Hasidic connection, and I think that was really influenced.
But the artists, while creating those sculptures, were aware of the Kabbalistic
Yes,
interpretations?
Newman himself was absolutely aware of what he was doing and of the Kabbalistic interpretations, 100%.
You have a question? You want to read a question?
Two
Or
more.
comments?
Something that comes to me.
Okay, should we unmute him? Okay, something that comes to mind is the holograph. When you break a holographic image, that even when broken contains the entire image, much like the art that the artist called as an entirety, right? That's a beautiful example or a beautiful way of conceptualizing this, right? Of a totality that is manifest in multiplicity. Anti-Semitism in the art world, perhaps. I don't think that's the case here. I think it's just ignorance. Well, which maybe that's the point, because oh, there we go. Seems like anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism itself is a form of ignorance, probably.
So you want to ask one more question?
Zim Zum 2, the one that's the image,
Yeah.
and sort of is this crack, is that looking up the side of the
Yeah.
sculpture? Is that what that is? Or-
Yeah, let's just go back to that image.
Yeah.
They're asking about Tzimtzum 2, right? So when Newman designed Tzimtzum, originally he intended it to be 12 foot high and with a footprint of 175 square feet. Right? So they're talking about a massive sculpture, right? Now, it was commissioned for an exhibition by a Japanese museum. So they had to ship it. They constructed it in New York, and they had to ship it to Tokyo, or I think Tokyo. So he actually downsized the original sculpture from 12 feet high to 8 feet high. And the square footage is 90 square foot. And that's the one that's on display at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the original smaller version, which was downsized in order to be shipped to Tokyo. After he died in 1985, his widow, authorized the creation of a second version of the sculpture according to the original specifications. And that's Zim Zum 2, which is held in the Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf, in Germany. That's, I think, still on display. So if anyone wants to go to Germany, I think it might just be worth it just for this. And yes, this image is taken from inside the sculpture because, like I said before, he wanted people to, it wasn't something to be looked at from the outside. He wanted people to experience it. And part of what's amazing about it is the subjective is so important because depending on the angle that you're looking at it from, you're seeing something entirely different. And so your concept of Tzimtzum, of exaltation, of the transcendence of God, or of feeling within God, it changes. Are you outside of it? Are you looking up at it? Are you inside? This is taken from below, within, looking up at the sky, right? And so you see the light flowing in from above, and the walls. You know, another interesting thing about this is that the sculpture is almost an inversion. It is an inversion of the synagogue design, because in the synagogue design, we're talking about transparent glass panels, right? A zigzagging set of corresponding glass panels. And in the sculpture, they become steel panels that are opaque, right? So it's almost like going back to the literal version of Tzimtzum, where Tzimtzum is about darkness, but it's obviously not at the same time, right? There's something very complicated and complex going on with this. And I'll just say one more thing related about this. There's a famous, related to Hanukkah, someone said Kabbalah Hanukkah. right? There's an artist, an Israeli artist called Yaakov Agam. And he became close to the Chabad, and he designed a giant menorah that's at Fifth Avenue in New York. It's a famous, iconic, the Agam menorah. And Agam actually, I think before he designed the menorah, he sent a book, an art book, a photo, one of these like coffee table art books, full of photos of his art. He sent it to the rabbis in the rabbi's library. And I bought a copy of that volume because I wanted to. Anyway, well, Agam had a very similar concept of art as being dependent on the subjective viewer. And all his pieces are designed so that they change depending on the angle, right? Or so that you can play with them and transform them, right? Which is a very similar thing to what's happening with Newman's piece of art. And just to add one more little piece, in a letter that the Rebbe wrote to Agam after he got this book, he wrote about how I see that in your work, you're attentive not only to the light and the color, but also to the shadow, which again is an idea of Tzimtzum, right? Of the shadow, and how the shadow too can be seen as something beautiful if you see it in the right kind of way, right? So.
Just one comment. And then,
Question? Let's just read this. I have an art print signed by Agam, right, where the image looks different from each angle. There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Eli Rubin, for that really fascinating and truly inspiring presentation. And I just want to use this opportunity to put a plug in for some writing that I've read of Eli's on Chabad.org. I think it's 3 articles about Tzimtzum that goes incredibly in depth and
you can also look out for a forthcoming book.
Oh, okay. Forthcoming book. Okay.
With Tzimtzum as the key theme.
But these are 3 foundational articles about this topic. I think less art, but more just about the Kabbalah of Tzimtzum that you can find on Chabad.org. And if anyone wants a link to it, I'll be happy to share it with you. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question.
One more question?
We send the link copy.
From here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you know whether those Kabbalistic collections and implications apply only to modern art and sculptures only, or also ancient art?
Right.
I'm referring specifically to the sculpture of David by Michelangelo.
Right.
And he tried to depict the characters.
Right. The haunt. Okay. Yeah.
It's not a misinterpretation. So do you know whether that sort of Kabbalistic collection applies to only to modern art or also to ancient, specifically whether it applies
Right.
the sculpture of David by Michelangelo?
Okay, so just to repeat the question is, do these Kabbalistic associations, do we also find them in earlier art, especially Michelangelo and?
You do.
Yeah. So, no, well, I don't know if you do. I think, let's answer it the following way. Kabbalah, especially in the modern period, meaning from 1600s onward, became very widespread in Europe in translation. Okay, so there was a Kabbalistic compendium of Kabbalistic works translated into Latin in the 1600s by a guy called von Helmont. There's a few different people. I don't remember all the names. It's called Kabbalah de Meduta. And people like Newton and Hegel all read these Kabbalistic texts. And it became part of Leibniz. We were all reading Lurian Kabbalah and Zohar. And in many cases, it became part of their, at least in a concealed form, part of their thinking, right? So it became enmeshed in science and culture already from the 1600s. I don't know if Michelangelo specifically would have been aware of this. I don't know exactly what his dates were. Maybe you can, and if he would have known about Kabbalah Duta, if he would have known from other sources, and I haven't researched it, but it is possible that in the last 400 years, there were other artists who were aware of this material. I know an article by a scholar at Johns Hopkins. His name is Pavel Mashenko, I think.
Yeah. Here's the paper.
No. This is a scholar of okay. So he wrote an article called A Portrait of the Kabbalist as a Young Man. And it's about a European aristocrat who was painted reading a Hebrew Zohar in maybe the 1700s. And he traces, how this came about. And so there you have an example of an earlier work of art. This is an oil painting, a portrait of a nobleman. It's in Germany somewhere. So there was this kind of semi-underground intellectual republic of Kabbalistic letters. And it did find its way in certain ways into the art world. The question is how much.
Interesting. So, where do I find more resources?
About the art.
Yeah, look.
Anything that's worth studying is probably already on Chabad. I'm just kidding.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
A lot of work to be done. A lot of research to be done. See, yeah.
Well, I have a collection of more than 25 sculptures